Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another edition of AUHSD Future Talks. I'm your host, Superintendent Michael Matsuda, and as our 7,000 plus podcast listeners know, that this show is dedicated to the future of education, so we can do a better job of helping our young people navigate a very complex journey called life. We've been very blessed to have so many amazing educational leaders and educational partnership leaders, from college presidents to amazing CEOs and corporate leaders, as well as wonderful teachers and our students themselves. Today, we have a very important partner in Orange County, the CEO of the Orange County Jewish Federation, Erik Ludwig, and Chief Impact Officer, Lisa Armony. Thank you so much for spending your time with us.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, we are delighted to be here. Thank you, Dr. Matsuda.
So we always start with a little bit of information about our guests and about your calling, your purpose. Erik, can you share with the audience, how did you find your calling and your purpose as the head of the OC Jewish Federation?
I think if I were to look back to a point in life that set me on this trajectory, it was probably growing up in Fallbrook, California, where I was raised, with a single mom at the East Gate at Camp Hamilton. And we were, at least as far as we knew in the 70s while we were there, the only Jewish family. And so I grew up confronting anti-Semitism directly and without a Jewish community around me. And I think the desire to hold and have a Jewish community is a lot of what set me in the direction that I'm working now. And that's, the last 25 years of my adult career has been leading Jewish communal life, either in Jewish community centers, in federations, or in Jewish spaces of academia, as you mentioned earlier.
Erik, looking back on your adolescence and what you went through, as many Jewish families have, in terms of the anti-Semitism growing up and the hatred, I'm sure, that was targeted at you at a young age. How were you able to not sort of hate back?
It's a great question, and one that I think is extremely challenging and pertinent to today. I think what I did, which may have not been the best way to navigate this, but I had to make a choice between identities in being known as Erik the Jew or being known as Erik the athlete. And because I was lucky to be a talented athlete, it was easy for me to create a space as Erik the athlete and hold that identity and a friendship circle that was different than the experience that I would have had if I wasn't able to.
So Lisa, same question for you, right? You grow up and you become this amazing educator, influencing and working with a lot of college students across this country. So tell us a little bit about your youth and your calling.
Sure, thank you. So my background is quite different from Erik's. I grew up on the East Coast in New Jersey, in a pretty large Jewish community. I went to Jewish school. I was very involved in Jewish youth movements. So I didn't encounter anti-Semitism as a child. But what drew me, I think, to Jewish a career as a Jewish professional was an experience that I had in elementary school. This was during the height of the Soviet Jewry movement, and for those who are not familiar with that, there were Jews living in the former Soviet Union who were the subject of persecution. They were not able to practice their religion. And at a certain point, particularly after 1967, some of them started to apply for exit visas to leave the Soviet Union. Many wanted to go to Israel and were denied. And when they were denied, they often lost their jobs, and the persecution amplified. And there was a very large movement to pressure the Soviet Union to allow them to leave, and also pressure on the United States to pressure the Soviet Union to allow Jews to leave. And as a kid in elementary school, we adopted a Soviet family that had been denied exit visas. We were writing letters to them. We were told never to expect a response back because they couldn't, but we were sending our letters registered mail, and they had to sign to acknowledge receipt. And when I got those receipts back with that signature, it really broadened my eyes to a community that was much larger than the one I was growing up in, a global community that we were taught to take responsibility for. So I think that's how I became, I think really that was the moment that set me on a path towards a career as a Jewish professional. But as an educator, I came into this space really as an advocate, not as an educator. At a time when things were starting to get very uncomfortable for Jewish students on some college campuses around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I was really hired to be an advocate for Israel and for the Jewish students. And I very quickly learned that advocacy on a college campus doesn't work very well, particularly when you come into an environment where people are taking positions without really fully understanding the background of the history and what the implications were for the positions they were taking. And I realized that if I were going to do this work in an authentic way, I was going to have to be an educator, not an advocate. And I've been working to develop educational programs ever since to bring in nuance and space for critical thinking and allow young people to really explore, history without being told.
Yes. So I'm glad you distinguished that, the difference between an educator and an advocate, because an advocate, there's just different connotations. And obviously we work with so many students that are confused by words and by meaning. So I'm going to ask a very basic question, but I think people are very confused by sometimes, what is anti-Semitism? How would you define that?
In its most basic definition, I would say anti-Semitism is Jew hatred of Jews. It's a phenomenon that's been around for thousands of years. At its root, it is very much a conspiracy theory that seeks to blame Jews for anything that a society deems as the most heinous or most evil. It involves scapegoating Jews. What's curious about anti-Semitism is that Jews can get blamed for things that are contradictory to one another. And so, for example, the communists would say that Jews are capitalists. And in a capitalist society, they would, say Jews are responsible for communism. But it's very much rooted in trying to find a people to blame for the thing that society fears or hates the most. And I think it then it takes on a variety of different manifestations as a result.
So Erik, you talked about identity, right, as an athlete versus a Jew. And let's go a little bit deeper in that, in this context of anti-Semitism. What does it mean to be a Jew versus someone who practices the religion called Judaism?
Well, I think that's not an answer I can provide, in the sense that what there are multiple ways of expressing Jewish life. Some of those expressions are religious expressions. Some of those expressions are cultural expressions. And on top of that, they're individual. So that there is a spectrum of ways in which people identify what it means to be Jewish to them. And that practice is across a set of ways of living that are values, but there is also a set of ways of living that are religious expectations and practices. Sometimes those are visible, and sometimes those are invisible, depending upon who and what different communities we're talking about. One of the challenges, I think, that students have, particularly students in the K-12 space, is that they are having to navigate a cultural climate that is anti-Jewish, and they're having to do so without a way for others to know that they are Jewish. And so the fact that they, if you will, assimilate into the broader society and are assumed to be just like everybody else becomes really challenging because their experience of life is from a different religious as well as cultural set of practices.
So I think the challenge for parents and families with their kids in school systems, and as you pointed out, that many Jewish Americans look white, Caucasian, right, in terms of fitting in, yet it seems like they have this duality growing up. We've heard about that time and again. And I think the challenge is if you, especially an adolescent, right, they want to belong and they want to fit in. And so sometimes what happens, they sort of deny who they are, right, culturally. And I think that this is a big challenge in all communities because we are ethnic / religious / culture. We have all those overlays. So what is, and this conference that was held a few months back at UC Irvine addressed some of these deeper, more complex issues. How would you advise the school district folks to be more sensitive to some of these complexities in terms of potentially students having to deny their own ethnic backgrounds?
Yeah, so I think we have different angles, both Lisa and I, in addressing this. One of the ways that we know in terms of working with educators is that educators have learned how to develop culturally responsive curriculum around race. And so one of the ways in which we want to reframe the conversation on anti-Semitism, or extend, maybe is a better way of saying that, extend the conversation, expand the conversation around anti-Semitism, is to begin to understand that cultural relevancy is as important around Jewish identity and Jewishness as it is around race. And so what does it mean to create a welcoming environment for an ethnically and racially diverse person? What does it mean to create a welcoming climate for Jewish students? And I want to complicate that by adding that, Jews are ethnically and racially diverse.
Right.
And so it's not as simple to say we all look white or that we all practice an Ashkenazi normative way. There is, in fact, different Jewish practices and different ways of expressing that, whether it's Sephardic or Mizrahi or African. There are many different ways in which we can see and engage Jewish life.
Right. So I'm going to go to another vocabulary term, and that is Zionism. How do we define that for our audience?
So Zionism has a number of definitions, I would say. If we look historically, Zionism comes from the term Zion, right? Which is a term for the land of Israel. And it really speaks to the Jewish people's connection to their indigenous homeland of Israel, which that connection is born when the Jewish people are born. and continues regardless of whether the Jews were living in the land or not. So we know, for example, that in the year 586, that there was the great exile of Jews and the dispersion of Jews around the world. While a small community stayed in the land, the majority of Jews lived elsewhere and stayed in different countries for thousands of years. And yet there remained an attachment to the land, a longing to return. It became part of Jewish practice and ritual and prayer, that longing. That's really the early origin of Zionism, is this attachment and this longing to return. In post-emancipation time, Zionism took on a more political understanding definition, which aligned with nationalist movements that were developing in Europe. And so Zionism became a form of Jewish nationalism, this idea that, like, Jews as a people had the same right to national sovereignty as other peoples, as Germans, as French, as Spanish. And so it developed as a concept, or I should say one form of Zionism, because there were also multiple forms of Zionism, but one form was a type of Jewish nationalism that ascribed to a return to the indigenous homeland, and along with it came a political plan to work with the international community to establish or reestablish an independent state homeland. Today, now that we're sort of in the post-independence years for Israel, Zionism has taken on another meaning, which is really a belief that Israel has a right to exist as a democratic and Jewish state, that the Jews continue to have a right to national self-determination. So, I mean, you can see it's a complex term, rooted, I think, in the same ideas, but that has evolved over time.
Yes. So, we're trying to educate ourselves, myself. I mean, I really appreciate this conversation too, so we can educate our young people, because they do want it. There's a hunger to understand many of these issues and understand each other. One thing I don't know if our students understand the history and the involvement of Jewish Americans in the civil rights period, and I know that could be a whole nother talk. But I do want to spend a couple short minutes just reminding our audience how important the coalition was with the Jewish community during the civil rights struggle, because right now you see there's tension amongst different ethnic groups, and not really acknowledging the both in the Black civil rights and the Latinx civil rights movements. Can you share just a little bit about that involvement? Because I could tell you right now, as a third-generation Japanese American, the Jewish community was very involved and very supportive of the movement to acknowledge the internment of Japanese Americans. So I know that there are a lot of close alliances between the Jewish American, Japanese, and Asian American community, but see you a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think the history of Jewish involvement, both in the civil rights movement and in other movements for rights for Americans and minority communities, is really rooted in Jewish values. And I think, when we're talking particularly about the civil rights movement, we're talking about a Jewish community that emerged in the aftermath of the Holocaust, including survivors who came to this country, as well as those who had been living here during those years. And I think that experience was transformative in terms of the Jewish community's need and desire to be engaged in the struggles of other American communities. And we see that, sort of across the board in terms of the way they engage, in terms of the level of relationship, the very deep relationships that evolved, particularly in those early years. And I think many Americans today, we know that the majority of American Jews tend to be more liberal, certainly in their social values, and many express their identity through their engagement in social justice work, in human rights work, and feel themselves very much allies to the struggles of other Americans.
So what is the relationship between anti-Semitism and racial bigotry? Because that's something that was, I think it's important that people understand that there is a historical connection between that.
So I think it's really challenging and it's really nuanced because there isn't a singular anti-Semitism. And so there are different experiences of anti-Semitism that Jewish people experience in different places within civil discourse and different educational spaces. So again, we look at the way in which Jewish identity is formulated, right? I'll use my own children as an example, right? So my children, my daughter is 14 years old, my daughter is Ethiopian, and my daughter is Jewish. And that identity, when she moves to a public space, is carried with her. And she has to navigate her Jewish identity differently if she's with Jewish friends and than she does when she's with her African American, Black, Latinx. And so I think if you're talking about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, we experience that across a spectrum of different places. So if you have a Jewish community member who might be in the LGBT plus community, where they would typically find allies in the LGBTQ plus community as a liberal space, they may not, because that community may in fact have different views about Zionism and carry that forward onto them and essentially othering them within that group. And I think that's a tremendously unique challenge of the intersectionality of being Jewish and facing both Zionism and anti-Semitism in different ways in each of those different spaces.
Lisa, you talked about this historically Jews being scapegoated for a number of whatever the problems are, blame this group. And this, I think that's probably why as a group, the Jewish Americans have a high sense of empathy for those who are being scapegoated or blamed as the other, right? As the other. How do we expand young people's sense of interconnectedness without sacrificing their individual identity?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that one of the things that we want to do is, first of all, help our young people understand their own identity and help them navigate the complexity of their own identity and develop their own sense of pride in their identity. Particularly when they're getting challenges from their peers and may have a tendency to want to hide their identity. We have to give them support, a sense of community, so that they have reasons to hold on to that community and to that identity and not shy away from it. I think at the same time, we have a responsibility to expose our young people to the stories, the lived experiences, and the narratives of others, and to work on that sense of empathy, so that they can be supportive of their peers in the same way that we would hope that peers would be supportive of them, and really sort of building. So we want to build a close sense of community within the, for them with their Jewish peers, and also broaden that sense of community and inclusiveness and belonging with others, and encourage them to really speak and share their stories and share their experiences and develop that empathy.
In the few minutes we have left, we're all Erik, what words of advice, as leader of the Jewish Federation, do you have for educational leaders to try to address some of the hatred and fear that's out in the social media, and there are some leaders, political leaders, and social leaders that are seem to be fomenting rise in anti-Semitism. What is your advice to us?
Yeah, so when I talk with educators, one of the challenges, particularly in K-12, this doesn't come up as much at the university level, but at the K-12 level, one of the challenges that I hear is the perception of navigating a religion, and the fear that jumping into the conversation means jumping into a religious conversation, or perhaps jumping into a conversation that the teacher or the administrator doesn't have the same level of confidence in holding. And so the conversation quickly moves to a space of comfort. Typically that might be about the unit on Holocaust. And I would encourage, in fact, educators to trust in an open conversation with students, Jewish and non-Jewish students, about how they understand what's happening here in terms of what is anti-Semitism when they hear the word, and to explore that openly with them and begin to have the touchstones of building awareness, and again, building a cultural literacy around what does it mean to be Jewish. How does that get expressed? Because there isn't a single way in which our young Jewish students are experiencing that thing. And so I think allowing students to be both the experts as well as teachers to have the comfort in not being the expert is perhaps the best way forward. And my recommendation for that is to really take the practices that you as an educator understand and apply to other spaces of racial and ethnic diversity, and apply them in the same way to the way in which you have conversations about anti-Semitism, or what is it like to be Jewish, so that you're opening a gateway to allow the students to be the cultural wisdom rather than yourself.
Well, that's a nice mic drop for the end of this interview. I think you really captured it. And on behalf of our 27,000 students and their families and our 1,300 teachers, I want to thank both of you for being our guest on this edition of AUHSD Future Talks. Thank you so much.
It's our pleasure.